Hi everybody. Good to see you for the last time. This is one of our last videos that we'll be doing together. I hope that you have learned much and I hope that you continue to learn. Today we'll be talking about one of the most obviously very technology impacting our society and or is it? And especially the interactive media. We've been talking about all kinds of technology, haven't we? We've talked about how radio impacted things and television and on to the internet and of media really impact our society. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. Reviewing a few of the things that we've discussed, we've talked about different kinds of theories, haven't we? The cultivation theory, remember that said, what you're listening to and observing feel about certain things. And we've talked about the agenda setting, the propaganda, information theory, and scientific theories way back at the beginning. Do you remember those? We've also talked about uses and gratification. What do we choose to watch at certain times in our lives, and why do we choose to watch those? Then, hope that you've caught this by now, that in our field, we want to be able to make generalizations about the way people communicate, because if we can make those generalizations, if we can draw those connections, then we can be better communicators. The ultimate goal is being the absolute best communicator that I can be. We've talked about things like Napster and how things. Remember, they had that file sharing software. They had about 28 million people wanting to download popular and obscure songs off the internet for free. And then we talked about how things like my freedom of speech, your freedom of speech, where are the lines drawn in freedom of speech and the new media? How has this impacted our society? And some of these issues have hit the courtroom, and I have no doubt they will continue to hit the courtroom. So some things that we want to talk about are the new communications technology and how are they really impacting mass media. And you say, well, shouldn't we have been discussing this from day one? Actually, we have been, but now we're just going to formally take a look at it on our last day together. Remember that new technology includes communications and their methods of storing and delivering and receiving. Don't limit yourself into thinking it is simply the sending, all right? It can include the storing and the delivering and the receiving. Interesting, as we look at this picture here, boy, that phone was cutting edge, wasn't it? Just a decade ago. And now it seems somewhat obsolete, does it not? Because it doesn't even have a full QWERTY keyboard. Imagine life before a full keyboard. Alrighty, know that new communications, CMC is a term that will be kicked around, computer-mediated communication. Its primary source is really social. When we deal with new media, we are dealing with social interaction. Obviously, this can still span business interaction, but as a teacher, when I go into the classroom, and if I have a classroom that is set up with computers, it's intriguing to me. I'm always analyzing people. I'm analyzing communicative situations. And more often than not, if there's a 10-minute break before class, they're on Facebook, my students. They are doing something social media oriented. What are some of the functions of new communications? Well, obviously information. There is a desire to get information out. And so you have places such as Wikipedia jumping up. You have asynchronous communication. That's where the communication takes time. What we are doing right now, you had to wait for me to create this, and then you observed it, versus the synchronous. And you've had sessions like that, where at the same time, you are communicating with Naomi and with some of your peers. And why is that a function? Again, we've got function of information. We also have functions of new media for explanation, for entertainment, the transmission of culture. You've got all kinds of functions that occur. Sometimes the information can be that which can be life-saving when we look at the medical field. And if you have some synchronous sessions between doctors, perhaps synchronous sessions between doctors and patients, that information can be. But recognize that new media spans and information itself. If you look at some of these that I've got around and the impersonal spanning all the way over to the personal, and if we were to put these from impersonal to personal, how do you think you'd order? Face-to-face, emails, cell phones, and brochures. How would you realign these? I think we definitely say that face-to-face was very personal, any one-on-one contact with the individual that created that brochure, and he or she just wants me to look at it. Then we've got the email. Again, it's somewhat of a flat transmission, whereas the cell phone, I am getting a message as well as hearing their voice. All right, so we see how mass media can begin to bridge, somewhat between the impersonal that we're doing right now. Somewhat takes away the impersonal. You're not simply reading a book. You're not simply hearing my voice. We've tried to give you somewhat of a personal by adding the touch of being able to see via the webcam, right? All right. Now, when we deal with cues filtered out perspectives, and I want you to go ahead and take notes on this, cues filtered out perspective. That deals with when we've got a message and we have removed the nonverbal cues. Creating and maintaining strong interpersonal relationships will be difficult, if not impossible. So just think of the name there. Think of the name. If it's cues filtered out, cues filtered out. It's the message without the nonverbals. Remember, we've talked about that before. Hope you've started to see the progression in ideas as we go through and we discuss certain things. But cues filtered out, you don't have the nonverbal cues. And when we remove those nonverbal cues, maintaining strong interpersonal relationships tends to be more of a challenge. Now, as you think of internet, trying to set up relationships, and this is definitely a rave. Now, I actually know a couple who met online. So obviously this actually can work, which is an amazing thing to me. But what is one of the issues when we deal with all these online dating sites? And I'm certainly not saying total thumbs up across the board for these situations, because the bottom line is there are many of them that I certainly would not recommend. However, a little bit too high here, but let me read this to you. It's what we call hyper personal communication, and I want you to go ahead and take notes on this. Hyper personal. Hyper obviously means above. If you have a hyperactive child or a hyperbole, you've got an exaggeration. A hyper personal communication is where there is, let me read that top to you, okay? Where there's a lack of social cues that actually lead to interpersonal relationships that progress more quickly and thus may be filled with misconceptions or lies. One more time. Where there's a lack of social cues that actually lead to interpersonal relationships that progress quickly and can be filled with miscommunications and lies. That's what we call hyper personal. And among those communication, there are, I should say, grave concerns regarding the hyper-personal communications. People who go to these websites and they say, wait a minute, I was misled. Why? Because he told me that he was a 6'5" brunette with a incredible build, and when I met him face to face, he was 5'5" and somewhat balding and overweight. Well, understand there's this lack of the real life one-on-one where I can see you, and I'm having to take the communication at face value, and the communication may not be real. Now again, without the familiar cues, those of the hearing and the seeing, without the familiar cues on which to base perceptions of others, we may exaggerate the cues that we have and thus evaluate others incorrectly. Again, we want to hear things. We want to see. When we don't have that, oftentimes that visual that often comes with face-to-face, then if we want, because we are yearning for, then we can misinterpret personal cues, and that has led some people to have some real issues with some of these online dating sites. Now, I've got a chart for you. Go ahead and fill it in that deals with the similarities between the old versus the new media. The old versus the new media. I think we could put print into old media. Okay, we could consider, for example, magazines. That would be considered an old media. But our new media would be anything that, within the last 30 years, especially that which occurs over the internet, over the phones, for eye touches. But we do similarities. Notice that the old media has the potential to reach millions of people, okay? When you think of magazine subscriptions, you can reach millions of people with those. When you think of how many, perhaps the New York Times sells a newspaper to, you've got the potential for millions. And the function of old and new was the same. You're providing your information, right, and your explanation and your entertainment. So those are definite similarities. But the interaction, the old media tended to be one way only. You picked up that magazine, you were hearing or you were reading from the writer's perspective, but you weren't necessarily communicating back. Whereas new media is considered to be a many to many model. In other words, if something is posted on YouTube, you can have many people observing it, right? And you can have many people in many different countries observing that same video. So the interaction obviously is just explosive, right, on the new media as well. The timing. Old media was almost exclusively asynchronous. Whereas the new media can be either. There can be the choice, correct? We can have synchronous in this class and we can have asynchronous in this class. So you've got similarities, but you obviously have some categories which are just incredibly different with reference to interaction and timing. Now, let's review very quickly uses and gratification. Remember, we choose media to satisfy a need. If we've had a bad day, sometimes you'll hear, or a day that's very stressful mentally, you'll hear people say, I just needed to veg. So they weren't necessarily after a program that would make them think. They weren't after a program that may be educational. Sometimes people just sit down and they just need to, release from their brain. I'm not suggesting that's right. I'm saying uses gratification theory says we choose our media based on a need. If I need to laugh, then perhaps I'm not going to watch, Masterpiece Theater and a production of Hamlet. All right, that won't make me laugh. Remember, then this new technology called the technology expectancy image gap theory. Whew, that is a mouthful. Say it 10 times fast, right? The technology expectancy image gap theory. And what that expresses is, so we've got new technology, new media, so guess what? We have new theories being created. That's kind of exciting. That through media, discussions of advancing technologies along with the business image promotions, okay? So what I want you to understand is, so you've got new technology, and you've got the media discussing this new technology, all right? So what happens? People begin to expect even more than a company can deliver. That is fascinating, isn't it? So that's called technology expectancy, all right? So you're expecting this new technology on the market. Image gap. right? So I have such high expectations of a technology. And then when the technology hits the market, after this hype has been occurring, perhaps as a consumer, I'm let down. So this is something that you in marketing need to pay attention to. Yes, you need to market, but you have to market in wisdom and with truth so that you don't have a backlash. I think we're familiar, most of us, with the Wii, and that has been a success beyond what any of the creators could have imagined. So much so that uh, there have been times in the past where certain stores would only stock X amount of the Wiis, and part of that was just supply and demand. Listen, as long as the Wii knew that it was highly popular, it could charge what it wanted, right? The Wii is not necessarily a cheap item, is it? Not only is the Wii cheap, but the software that goes along with it is not cheap, right? So I think that it can be said of the Wii that the expectations were met. There was a big marketing push prior to it hitting the market, but the expectations were met. Consequently, people are still purchasing the product and they're purchasing new software. When it comes to things like your iPod Touch, we have had people very pleased with it. Consequently, more and more people are buying it. You've got things like the App Store where you can download things either for free or by paying. But you've got to be careful. There are some new things hitting the market, such as dual screen laptops. Perhaps some of you have those. So there has been much hype. We've got certain stores that are coming out with these. And the question is, will these dual screen laptops meet the expectations of the consumers? Or will the consumers be let down? Why do I say that? All right. We've got here a picture of the iPhone, and in particular, I want you to think of the iPhone 4 that came out. And when the iPhone 4 came out, there were some critical issues. Now, you're in technology, you probably remember this, but one of the key issues was that one of the receivers was down here at the bottom where you would be holding that technology in your hand. And so it was disturbing the transmission. And I cannot fathom how all this testing for the iPhone occurred and nobody captured that this was going to be an issue. I don't know if they were always doing their testing as it sat in some kind of a holder. I can't fathom that they did not come up with that. But the bottom line is there was huge hype. People stood in line for several hours so that they could claim they had the iPhone. I heard one lady say that she stood in line for 5 hours because she had pre-ordered five for her company and she wanted to be able to hand it out to some of her workers and how disappointed she was. And you know what? Consumer Reports then came out, said, we don't recommend the iPhone 4 because there's so many issues, and the Apple stocks dropped. Why? There had been an expectancy on the part of the consumer. There had been hype by the company, and the hype did not meet what the expectancy was, and there was fallout. All right? So I think that gives us pause to stop and say we have to be wise in our marketing approach. We have to be wise in our production of our new products. And we understand that consumers have high expectancy nowadays. They're not going to settle for mediocre anymore. We have to give them a good product. Now, what are some consequences of new media? Well, in our final discussion here, I kind of want to go full circle with media. And it's, if we think about things that were auditory, things like radio, go back to when we discussed War of the Worlds, right? And radio said, you know what, we want to provide people with some fun, with a release. And you had your radio drama. You had things like Abbott and Costello coming on and people just enjoying the mirth as they sat around their radio. Well, then, after you had the television created, television said, you know what? We can tell stories too. And so what happened? Radio lost its niche. Understand that technology is successful when it has a niche. So television said, we can tell stories too. We'll start telling stories. And what happened? Radio said, well, we're not going to just sit here. We're not going to be unwise. And we're not going to fail to keep moving forward. So radio redefined itself. Well, we won't just tell stories. Now we'll go ahead and add music. And you had AM began all kinds of music. And so you had your various stations that would provide the various niches. And then you had certain stations able to sell certain ads, right? Because they had certain consumers. What happened? Television said, hey, good idea. We will do that as well. And you had, at first, just certain shows that began being associated with music. Now, obviously, you have entire stations, a lot of which I would not recommend that you are viewing. But you have television saying, we're going to get that niche of the market as well. Radio kept adapting. Radio redefined itself as a leader in talk radio. And you had a lot of your AM stations coming on board. And you'd have liberal-only talk radio. You'd have conservative-only talk radio. Perhaps you'd have some talk radio that was Christian in nature. Then you began having talk radio that was perhaps regionally specific. All right? So radio, again, found a new niche. Well, now what? Now you have internet that has talk radio. Okay, you had this new genre jump in. Now we have radio, and it was competing somewhat with the television market, but now radio is actually competing with the internet. Why? Because you've got this streaming radio that goes over the internet. Perhaps they have some of the same advertising, but now you can actually provide radio that is advertisement free. And as a consumer, do I want to sit around and listen to a lot of advertisement? Perhaps not. Perhaps I just want that. And you've got things like Sirius Radio, right? And you've got the streaming radio where you can get just choosing right on your car radio specific genres that you want to listen to. In other words, what we keep recognizing and what we keep seeing is that new media has to keep adapting. Why? Because as technology moves forward, as technology advances, it has to keep getting that niche of the market. But then you have to sit back and say, as someone who both uses and perhaps will be impacting new media, how have we seen that new media can impact not only just a consumer, but how about a society? Or how can it impact an entire market? Or how can it have a major global impact? Because really what I want to leave you with, crew, is this. How has new media impacted the spread of gospel? And I would say immensely. You've got countries that perhaps missionaries are not allowed into, and yet they can, through new media, perhaps hear the gospel. You've got people who are far, far away, perhaps from other civilizations, and yet through new media and through translators, even if you're unable to perhaps get a missionary there, perhaps they can still hear the gospel through new media. This is fascinating. This is just changing, just in 4 years, 5 years, new media has altered communications. It has changed communications. And in so doing, it has changed the world. And that is amazing for you to consider. I have just so enjoyed being with you this semester. I hope that you continue learning and researching and changing the face of new media as you change the world for Christ. Have a good and godly day. For of what lasting value is a good day if it's not also godly? We'll see ya.